Welcome back to the Strategic Classroom. Today, we're jumping right into a tactical explainer of the 1962 Ladakh campaign. We're going to bypass the politics completely and focus squarely on the raw military realities on the ground. We're talking logistics, absolutely brutal terrain, and the sheer operational nightmare of waging war in the high Himalayas.
Now, as we get into this, I want you to keep one fundamental military question in the back of your mind. Can an outpost actually survive without support? That's really the crux of our analysis today. We're looking at troops stationed in some of the most isolated, breathtaking, and frankly unforgiving terrain on the planet. When push comes to shove, can sheer bravery save a military outpost with zero tactical or administrative backup? Well, let's find out.
Okay, here's a quick look at the briefing overview. We're going to systematically break down this campaign by looking at the forward policy, the sheer asymmetry of power, the northern battles, the legendary stand at Pangong So, the Indus Valley pincer, and finally, rebuilding and recovery. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Forward Policy, Establishing the Front.
So to really understand 1962, you have to look at the Chinese-built Aksai Chin Road, Highway 215, which cut right across the Aksai Chin Plateau. Building this in such a remote region completely blindsided New Delhi, and it triggered India's forward policy. The idea was to push posts forward to firmly hold unoccupied areas and block any further infiltration along a massive 300-kilometer front. Basically, Ladakh turned into this insane high-altitude chessboard where both sides were establishing overlapping posts, literally staring each other down.
But here's the thing, the execution of this policy was incredibly precarious. By October 1962, a huge chunk of Indian troops were scattered across 70 totally isolated outposts, spread over this massive area essentially just to show the flag. And this was despite loud and clear warnings from the Western Command. They knew that threatening this area, especially right near that crucial Aksai Chin Road, without adequate backup, was basically inviting a violent reaction. But political directives pushed it through anyway, setting up these remote outposts with, well, pretty much zero tactical or administrative support.
Moving to Section 2, Asymmetry of Power, a Logistical Mismatch.
This right here shows the stark reality of the situation on the ground. The Chinese buildup was textbook operational strategy. They used established roads, concentrated their firepower, and recycled troops from their 4th Infantry Division until they had built up a full division strength. On the flip side, the Indian Army was crippled by massive distances, completely isolated pockets of troops, and practically non-existent reserves. To give you an idea of how tough the logistics were, it took India over a year and a half just to move a single infantry battalion into Ladakh.
And the result of that mismatch? Before launching any major offensive, the Chinese forces deliberately built up a mind-blowing 10-to-1 numerical superiority. 10-to-1! Not to mention a 7-to-1 advantage in artillery firepower. They weren't just planning a skirmish, they were setting up to completely overwhelm the area, carefully making sure to block any possible routes of withdrawal for the defenders.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Northern Battles, the October Onslaught.
Right, so on October 20th, the Chinese set their sights squarely on the Dalit Beg Oldi, or DBO, and the Galwan River Valley subsectors. They specifically targeted the commanding hilltops and crucial posts that were threatening their own rearward communications. The ultimate goal? Wipe out all the Indian outposts that they saw as intruding across their 1960 claim line.
The onslaught kicked off at first light on October 20th with intense 30-minute artillery barrages, and the fallout was grim. At point 5270, the 14 J&K militia lost 42 men, with another 20 taken prisoner. The Galwan post, which was held by the 5 Jat, took a pounding for a full day before finally being overrun. But amidst all this overwhelming firepower, there were some unbelievable acts of individual heroism. For instance, at Post Parmodak, sitting at an agonizing altitude of 17,000 feet, Havildar Tulsi Ram's entire section was wiped out. But he didn't back down. He stood his ground, firing his light machine gun all by himself to hold off the advancing Chinese until he was finally gunned down. Despite these incredible stands, the sheer volume of attacks wiped these northern posts off the map in just hours or days, eventually forcing the total abandonment of DBO.
Next up, Section 4, Stand at Pangong So, the Gorkha Resistance.
Shifting our focus south to the northern bank of Pangong So Lake, we find the Sirajap complex. This was held by a severely understrength unit of the 1/8 Gorkha Rifles, and the positions were totally isolated. They couldn't physically support each other. Now, because the Chinese only had a slender margin of superiority in this specific pocket, they actually put together a dedicated ad hoc task force of 117 personnel. Their single mission? Eliminate these heavily outnumbered Gurkhas.
The Chinese artillery started hammering the complex right at 0600 hours, but despite the devastating barrage, the Gurkhas held their ground. They actually managed to beat back 2 massive Chinese assaults. And then, when the Chinese started forming up for a third wave, the surviving Gurkhas didn't just wait in their trenches. No, they leapt out for a final ferocious clash with just their kukuris and bayonets, charging head-on while screaming their legendary battle cry, Ayo Gorkhale!
By 0830, the battle was over. Most of the Gurkhas had fallen, lying alongside roughly 100 Chinese troops on the battlefield. For his incredible leadership and absolute supreme courage during this grim defense, the commander of the Gurkhas, Major Dan Singh Thapa, was awarded the Param Veer Chakra, which is India's highest military decoration.
All right, on to Section 5, Indus Valley Pincer, the Southern Maneuver.
Right after the battles up north and at the lake, the Chinese quickly pivoted even further south toward the Indus Valley to neutralize any remaining threats. And honestly, the logistics of this move are staggering. The Chinese forces marched 500 kilometers over rough, frozen tracks in exactly 3 days and 2 nights. And because India had opted not to use its air force for combat, the Chinese could move across this barren, open terrain in broad daylight with absolute impunity. They executed a textbook pincer maneuver. You had one group cutting off the northern flank, while a much heavier southern group launched the main assault to surround the Indian troops. But luckily for the defenders, the Chinese southern flank actually got delayed. That left the trap partially open, which allowed the Indian troops to pull off a relatively orderly withdrawal during the night of October 27th.
Section 6. Rebuilding and Recovery. Rapid Consolidation.
So after those relentless attacks in October, there was a brief, tense lull in the fighting. And during this window, the Indian military command kicked into high gear to rapidly consolidate their defenses. It was a massive, desperate scramble. The newly raised 3 Himalayan Division, under the command of Major General Budh Singh, was stood up at Leh on October 26th. They rapidly shuffled their existing brigades around. The 114 Infantry Brigade moved to lock down the critical defense of Trishul, while the 70 Infantry Brigade was brought in to secure the Indus Valley. The military was finally trying to match those massive political borders with actual structured defensive depth.
Which leads us to one of the most unbelievable aviation feats of the entire era. To reinforce those high-altitude forward bases, the Indian Air Force used their AN-12 aircraft to literally airlift 2 troops of heavy AMX-13 light tanks from the 20 Lancers directly into Trishul, right alongside field artillery and heavy mortars. It was an absolutely staggering logistical achievement that totally transformed the defensive posture in that sector.
So what's the big takeaway from the 1962 Western Sector Campaign? It proves with brutal, undeniable clarity that high mountains reward preparation, not presence alone. Look, the bravery of soldiers like Havildar Tulsi Ram and Major Dan Singh Thapa is beyond question. But heroism alone can't magically replace solid supply lines, mutually supporting positions, and concentrated firepower. It leaves us with a critical question for any future conflict. How does a nation ensure its military logistics dictate a destiny of victory rather than just hoping isolated outposts can survive? Thank you for joining me in the Strategic Classroom. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next explainer.